Welcome to another lecture live. And these two kind of time periods and comparisons are one of my favorite areas to kind of look at. And I think are a good example of just what cultural preferences mean at the time and how they display themselves in various artworks done by artists. 1 second, let me close my door real quick so I don't bother everybody in the house. Okay, sorry, we had all the screen doors open so everybody through the house could hear me doing my lecture. Okay, so the Byzantine era is what you would expect. The Byzantine Empire was under Roman rule, right? But it's found in more Eastern origins. Now there was a great East-West schism that we'll kind of talk about, but just know that although they were still technically parts of the Roman Empire, there was definitely an Eastern-Western distinction between the two, and that just kind of kept rolling as they made the great split between the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodoxy, which we'll kind of get into. But just to kind of introduce it, historians, a lot of people throughout history have mentioned that a lot of the work during kind of these lost Middle Ages, this medieval period, this Byzantine era, some people call it the Dark Ages, that the art was not engaging, that it wasn't as good as the Renaissance, that look what the Renaissance accomplished. Everything was so much more realistic, and so thereby this earlier style is just more primitive. But that's not necessarily true because it served a very specific cultural and religious context for the people at the time that we will get into. So just so you know, the Byzantine Empire is a very contentious one. It was full of social, political, and religious strife. Following the great East-West schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and the Catholic Church, everything began to slowly shift as the West further distanced themselves from the rest of the empire. However, we will see throughout the rest of this lecture that Byzantine art still plays a large role in the culmination of medieval art and even the later Gothic style, and even after the schism between the two churches. So there is an element of the Byzantine era that, in a very real sense, does not actually leave the Western tradition, but is somewhat reborn. And just so you know, Renaissance artists did have their preference. Not every artist, which we'll come to see, just automatically went to Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. But there were some artists like Sandro Botticelli that, although they had the talent to make more realistic figures, still relied on this more naturalistic, almost supernatural concept of what these figures are meant to look like. And actually, there were a lot of artists that during the Renaissance that preferred that. So medieval art, just so before we get into it, is used to characterize earlier Western movements in Europe, whereas Byzantine delineates Eastern culture and art reflective of Eastern Orthodoxy specifically. Now, during this great East-West schism of the churches, the splitting up of the whole church, there were definitely theological considerations that pushed them to separate from one another. And you can always look up there are theological considerations of baptism, of the Eucharist, of different things that you can go and look at. But eventually these theological differences became so great between each culture that the churches eventually split. Now, both essentially Byzantine and medieval style play a role in the foundation of the Italian Renaissance and the overall Renaissance period, though Renaissance art contains theological understandings found in the Western Church, while alluding somewhat to a more Eastern artistic style. So this is a good example of Byzantine art, and if you need any references to where you can find these paintings or frescoes, then just let me know, but they're not on the PowerPoint, just to save us a little bit of time and clarity and kind of keep the focus on the shifting style rather than who painted what. But whereas classicism emphasized heightened reality, so this is where we get this idea of the classics that kind of extended from the later Renaissance period into the Baroque, into the more Victorian era, kind of into French Rococo. That was identified more as a classical style. That means these figures were very either naturalistic or realistic in nature. Byzantine art emphasized the anti-natural, forming a more symbolic approach. And this had a very specific spiritual component as well that's important. Now, the reason for this kind of shift is largely unknown, though, and kind of these differences. Obviously, it's cultural preference and it's spiritual interpretation, but what we need to understand that it's not due to a decline in artistic talent from kind of the ancient period to the medieval period and the Byzantine era, and then everything kind of started to ramp back up in the Renaissance, and then better artists came along. But what you need to understand is that this art style actually served the people in a spiritual component as well. So when I say anti-natural, the idea behind all of these religious paintings in the Byzantine era, and as we will see in the later medieval and Gothic styles, formed an idea that these figures are not meant to be seen like you and me. They are in another and very distinct plane of existence, a very supernatural plane of existence, and that means that they are holy, right? These are holy icons. These are meant to be venerated. These figures are meant to be respected. They're not meant to be seen in our personal context. We're not meant to see ourselves reflected in these figures. We're meant to see them heightened, right? So there's a hierarchy here. It's kind of like people here on earth and all the saints here now, but then there are the saints that have already died and are in heaven. These are the saints that, you know, are in purgatory, or that, you know, however you want to describe it. These are meant to be venerated, these figures are. And particularly a lot of them have to do, you know, with the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist, and a lot of the apostles and disciples are particularly represented, but you also see saints represented as well. But this is the biggest distinction that historians have come to find, is that these figures served a spiritual purpose where the Renaissance was not concerned about that spiritual purpose. They wanted to see themselves reflected in the art. And that was like this heightened idea of humanism, but humanism was not happening during this time. I mean, maybe in small pockets you had philosophers, but for the most part, these figures are painted this way, in this anti-natural and very flat style, to delineate their spiritual nature. So this is a good example of the vacillation between Greek and Roman classical heritage and later Byzantine styles. So as you can see, the Byzantine style was not always just super flat, but there were artists that paid attention to more rounded figures and more details. Just know that these artists could produce what the ancients were producing. They just chose not to, because their particular style, their particular goals with this art for the people meant something else. They weren't trying to picture themselves, right? But these are good examples that there was a lot of artistic talents and the artistic talent happening during the period. But just notice that, you know, look at the details on the robes, and these are relief sculptures, and you can see kind of this three-dimensional nature that they're interested in. You can definitely see there is still like an idea of flatness and an idea of like this atmospheric perspective right here on the same plane is not at all convincing, but it is telling you that this is a different realm. This is a spiritual realm. This is a higher realm than what the people are, where the viewers are viewing these pieces right now. But I wanted to see, this is a good example that artists were still very good at what they did, but they were incorporating a particular style in order to reflect theological ideas. So there is quite a bit of diversity of expression, and when we look at the media of all of these works, mosaics were very important, sculptural reliefs were very important, works in gold were very important. So there was a little bit more diversity of an approach in the Byzantine and kind of medieval eras that we will see, rather than the Renaissance. So when you think of the Renaissance, you think of frescoes, you think of oil paintings, and you think of sculpture, and you think of architecture. But mosaics kind of went out of style. Works in elaborate gold kind of went out of style as the period moved on, although there were some pockets that were still working in that. But it wasn't on such a large scale. But there was this diverse area that artists had a lot of different mediums to choose from. So mosaics were a very big deal. And mosaics, I don't know if anybody has been to some of older churches around Italy or France, or a lot of places in Europe, a lot of these pockets in Europe. But mosaics were a very big deal because they could reflect gold very well. And gold, as we'll come to find out, it was a very important component of expression in the Byzantine era. It actually symbolized a supernatural presence because it was a precious material, it was an expensive material, and so people did not employ gold just for the fun of it. It meant that, oh, this is something that we need to pay attention to. But mosaics were a way for a lot of the candlelight to actually reflect in the building, and in that reflection it would reflect light back onto the people, because obviously they didn't have electricity, right? So they had to light their churches somewhere, and there wasn't just a lot of natural light coming through these large gigantic windows in particular, especially at certain points during the day, especially in the evenings. So they needed a way to also not only reflect spiritual components, but reflect actual light as well. And so mosaics became an important artistic expression as well. But as you can see, this is a very Byzantine mosaic style. You can see these figures are very flat, and we see Jesus at the center, and he's on top of a mountain. So this is a mountain, but it's obviously not a very convincing mountain or a convincing display of space, but it's meant to tell us that this is a supernatural picture. This is a supernatural realm. Now, what's fun about the Byzantine and moving on to the more medieval style that still was employing a lot of Byzantine components is that during kind of this shift from Eastern to Western, you really can't tell whether something is more Byzantine or something is more medieval. Now, I don't know if you guys had decided which one was Byzantine and which one was medieval, but this one on the left is actually from a Greek artist working in the Byzantine style, and this is from a Western European manuscript page done about 50 or so years later. But you can see how similar the styles are, and we're fixing to dive into the importance of manuscripts and personal devotion. But you can definitely see that these styles, this artist was definitely looking at the earlier Byzantine style. Okay, the churches were not so separated yet, so even though artists continued kind of in Eastern Orthodoxy to create figures like this, and they actually still create figures like this today if they are building churches, because it's such an impactful style. The Western world was using this as the foundation, which will easily become the foundation for medieval, Gothic, and later Renaissance art. So, as we expand into Western, medieval, and Gothic art, an Eastern influence does remain. And it even does remain, I would say probably, I'm sure other historians would argue with me on this, but Byzantine style is highly decorative. You can obviously see that in some of the gold reflected in it, and it's highly detailed. And we know that there is a shift in the late Renaissance and then the Baroque period in particular, where this kind of idea of drama and embellishment comes back into play, but it's kind of reborn in this Western Renaissance tradition. I would say that idea actually comes from the Byzantine style, kind of this idea of busy embellishments. You know, there's a lot of drama and impact happening in each work of art that we're going to look at. So I would say there is always an element of the Byzantine era that does remain well into the Renaissance. Now, manuscripts and personal devotion were very important in the medieval era, and obviously the Byzantine era as well. You'll find that Eastern influence largely remained in very personal, reflective art as well. Now, these manuscripts, although some of them were used for public devotion, you know, where a priest or a certain figure would read off these manuscripts, most of them were actually used for private devotion. A lot of them are a book of hours, which is just like a prayer book with all these elaborate pictures. Some of them are introductions to certain gospels that a family would collect and keep, a wealthy family in particular. But this idea of these flattened embellishments remained, this Eastern influence remained throughout the production of manuscripts well into the Renaissance period. And I don't know that manuscripts actually even took on a more realistic aspect of the Renaissance style, because manuscripts artists were a bit different from, you know, artists that we consider, you know, the masters today. So this Eastern influence of flattened works, very colorful but very dramatic, very embellished work, remained in these manuscripts. And gold, as I mentioned before, was an important medium of expression as well. These are actually both medieval works. So this was not done in the East. This was not part of the Eastern Orthodoxy. This was not petitioned by them, or they were not patrons of these things. This was actually done in the medieval. This was actually done in medieval Europe. And this is from a church. This mosaic is from a church in Italy, but you can see how largely and how important the communication was between the two churches, even though there was this great schism. So just remember that these distinct artistic styles reflect changing cultures, and it's really not who held the most talented or smart or original artists. There was just a large scale of communication going on, which is how the Renaissance essentially was born. And gold in particular, as I said, was meant to reflect a heightened spiritual realm. As we kind of move on into like medieval and Gothic art, gold was still employed largely until about probably the late Renaissance, or maybe the high Renaissance. So Gothic art, I've kind of titled the middle ground. It kind of blew up. So it originated with French architecture and then kind of quickly spread throughout Europe. And in some pockets never truly left. So when we think of Gothic art, we usually think of Gothic architecture, but it did extend into the visual arts as well. And when we think of Gothic architecture, we think of a lot of the cathedrals, probably the cathedral in Milan. We think of Notre Dame. We think of these old, very impactful churches. And Gothic art really played a lot with this idea of the Byzantine era because it delineated a very spiritual space with a lot of embellishment. But Gothic art in particular emphasized, it was kind of the foundation of emphasizing this idea of naturalism. And we can kind of see this in this example right here. And this was taken from a French church, but we can see that there are ideas of the Byzantine. So in these niches right here, these roundels right here are very important in Byzantine art and Byzantine architecture. But they've essentially been reborn because these figures seem like they really are starting to escape these walls. They're a bit more three-dimensional. They're not quite as flat, although the space itself is not necessarily, or the perspective is not necessarily just really engaging or really realistic. We do see there is a definite shift from this kind of flattened, very supernatural figure to perhaps these figures are gaining a little bit of character that you can find in human personality, right? So they're no longer just these people in books or in art, but they're kind of starting to gain a personality, a personhood. So the Gothic style, like I said, reintroduced concepts of naturalism, and it's considered a very important step towards the enlightened Renaissance style. Now, I don't mean to say enlightened, that it was better, but when I say enlightened Renaissance, it means that these ideas were really largely being shared between these two worlds, and in Europe in particular, a lot of styles were developing very, very quickly. Now, it does take kind of the North and the Northern Renaissance a little bit more time to kind of pick up because in Italy in particular, there was just a lot going on. There were a lot of artists sharing their ideas. They were traveling all across the Italian peninsula to different places like Milan and Florence and Rome and certain important pockets in Italy. And they were sharing these ideas. But this idea of the Gothic style came over to Italy, made its way over to Italy eventually, and was very important in the later founding of the Renaissance style. So a lot of people wonder where exactly this shift happened between this kind of Byzantine medieval style and the Renaissance style. And it shifted with, like I said, these dudes. So Cimabue and Duccio are considered by many fathers of the Italian Renaissance. And now you can ask different and various historians, which one really started to do, a lot of people say like Cimabue was really the father because he started to give kind of life into his figures, but people say but a lot of historians disagree and say, no, he was maybe moving towards that, but Duccio was the one that actually released this concept of realistic figures from their flattened Byzantine style. So really it's for you all to decide, but it definitely shifted with these two figures. And this happened in the early or late 12th, early 13th century. So Cimabue and Duccio are very important figures in art history, as you can imagine, because a lot of people consider them fathers of the Renaissance. This is some of Cimabue's work. And what I want you to see is that obviously he's looking at this earlier medieval and Byzantine style. You can see that his figures are very flat. You can see that these perspectives in space are not necessarily engaging, but there's this altarpiece on the left that you see in comparison to this altarpiece on the right, and you can actually begin to see some subtle shifts. Now, although these angels are the exact same size and that wouldn't actually happen, you know, and it looks like they're just like sitting on top of one another, you can actually see some of the shift in perspective with this throne that the Virgin sits on, that he is playing with some linear perspective here. And this is why so many people like studying him, because this idea of linear perspective, creating realistic and engaging space is a key component in the Renaissance. And we can see that this shift, it seems like the Virgin is actually sitting on a throne and she's not just kind of like hovering above this throne. So we can see that there is a definite shift in interest into realistic perspective. And notice with these in particular, the subtle hints of naturalism while remaining in a more Byzantine Gothic influence. You can see that this figure is actually getting some emotional value. Now, even though her face is still flat, we can see that her eyes are a bit more detailed. Her face is a bit more sad. It's more penitent, right? This was very popular. But in particular, I wanted to look at this work of Christ on the cross. We can see that his body starts to take, even though it's very flat and it's very elongated, we can see that it's starting to take more realistic qualities. We can see that the skin is starting to become more sallow or more sagged and hollow a bit. You know, it's a bit more green in certain areas, picturing, which it kind of delineates this idea of death. But we can also see that even though he's not putting his full weight right here, there is a shift in this body, right? This seems like more of a body rather than a flattened figure. And that emphasis on the body is very important in a more humanistic Renaissance context. Now we're going to go to Duccio, and his work is a little bit easier to see and engage with. Now, this throne in particular, even though he's doing the same thing as Cimabue was doing, with his angels kind of being the same size all around, we can actually see that he's playing with some perspective himself in the throne. And we can see that he's paying attention to the Virgin's body in particular. Now, although this is still very flattened, we can see that he's interested in the same ideas of perspective as his predecessor, Cimabue. And if we look at this Virgin in particular, we can see that he's even paying more attention into the folds of this drapery on these legs. So he's paying attention to the legs and how the hips work in conjunction with the shoulders and the legs and the knees in particular. We can see that he's engaging a little bit more in this tactile nature of the Virgin actually touching the Christ child, which is a very motherly instinct. You know, in the Byzantine era, this was not it, right? You know, these figures seem distant. They were meant to seem distant. But we can see this gap is starting to close in, that we can see the Virgin is letting the Christ child kind of play with her robes, right? These elements are very important into making a painting feel relatable. Now, as we go on, this is one of Duccio's works as well, and notice the twist of the body and the use of atmospheric perspective to make the scene a bit more naturalistic. So although we're not necessarily looking at the greatest example of atmospheric perspective, we can definitely see that he's trying to release these figures from their flattened identities, right? We can see that this mountain right here that Christ is meant to be standing on, this very rocky plain, is meant to go back into space and delineate space here. And so you can see that the bodies are also starting to shift, and there seems to be a little bit of movement. And he's also, you know, using his artistic skill. He's proclaiming his artistic skill because he's showing different bodies in different poses at different angles. So there is an emphasis on what the bodies are doing, and that they're a little bit more persuasive in that there's actually a bodily figure there. And like I said, the Renaissance progresses very quickly. So here come the big boys, right? During the Renaissance, there was a large-scale sharing of ideas and the art developed incredibly quickly. And that's why it's so much fun to study, because this period of 250 to 300 years, there's just a ton of stuff going on. This is actually a work by Masaccio. Now you can see these figures are flattened, but you can also see, but now we've got a figure that whose back is towards us, and this was not seen in earlier work, right? And we can see these very fleshy and muscular legs. We can see that he's paying attention to what these bodies are doing, in particular this figure and Christ over here. We can see some interaction between these figures, and we can see some use of a little bit of interest in linear perspective, but mainly atmospheric perspective with these mountains in the distance. And so even though it's flattened to us, because we're used to looking at, you know, very realistic works by Renaissance artists, later Baroque artists, and even contemporary artists today, we can tell that there is an interest in shifting forms and this idea of naturalism. And so I put these kind of together so we can see this a little bit better, and we can see kind of the progression of what kind of Masaccio and later Renaissance artists were doing. So this is a work by Masaccio as well, Christ on the Cross. It's a fresco piece. Now this art historians love this piece because he is using not only the architecture to give us some convincing space, but he's also using linear perspective with this ceiling and how this tomb is kind of shrinking into the space. He's also using that pyramid scheme that Leonardo begins to employ later on in his career. And I think these three works are fun because you can see how the art is starting to progress, right? So this is by Piero della Francesca, who is another artist. And you can see that these figures are flat, but you can see the same interest in atmospheric perspective. And you can see in his later work that that he's starting to shrink characters, he's starting to shrink figures to give us an idea that this space is real. His architecture is becoming increasingly more realistic, or definitely naturalistic, but it feels like we might be invited in. And that was a concept that the viewer was meant to be invited into these works. Whereas during the Byzantine era, that was not happening. Okay, we weren't invited, you know, that was on a whole other plane. During this humanistic Renaissance shift, and this emphasis particularly on the body and particularly on the goodness of how God made man, we definitely see this influence and engagement with the viewer. And as you can see, an interest in naturalism is increasing, and we're losing major components of the Byzantine style. By this point, a lot of artists aren't employing gold. There are still some that are employing gold because, you know, there are patrons that are trying to match what's already in the churches. And so there are definitely artists that are working in gold. Like I said, not all the Byzantine elements just left at once, but I wanted to show you where the Renaissance was headed. Now, these are obviously works from Sandro Botticelli. And like I said, he had all the talent to create a convincing figure like Da Vinci and Raphael and Michelangelo. But he did enjoy this more flattened style with an interest in naturalism because he did enjoy delineating these supernatural figures. But as you can see, we are moving to a more heightened reality. We see definitely flesh tones. They're no longer kind of these gold, orange, yellow tones anymore. We can see the personhood of these figures. We can see that these figures were almost based on real people, especially if you're looking at this work from Botticelli on the right. We can see that these are meant to emphasize different figures of young men in Florence in particular, and they actually they're not the same face, right? They're the same style because, you know, it's the same artist. You know, Botticelli does have that Botticelli type face, but they are starting to look more personalized, and they're starting to be more reflective of the audience that they were, in a sense, witnessing to. Now, we're moving on rather quickly, but I wanted you to see kind of the fun progression. Leonardo is really a major shifting point, and he was who later masters eventually built upon. Now, this work on the left is by Verrocchio. not Leonardo, and Leonardo's works, Virgin of the Rocks, is over here on the right. But you can see definitely how these figures are beginning to shift. Obviously, you know, atmospheric perspective is being used more by Verrocchio here, who was an earlier artist, but we can definitely see an emphasis, especially on these legs, on these figures. We can even see the rib cage right here. This is meant to be John the Baptist, right? And so he was in the wilderness, so he's kind of meant to display this idea of kind of like starving. And so anyway, we can definitely see an emphasis even on the figure of Christ too. There is this bodily emphasis that we have not seen up until this point, even a little bit, even more realistic and heightened than Cimabue's Christ on the cross. And so it's very, very, and now people love talking about these two angels in the left because they do believe that Da Vinci painted those, because it does have a very Da Vinci-like face, but that's another debate. Now moving on to Leonardo's work, we do see a more convincing atmospheric perspective, very detailed and attention to nature in general, because there was a lot of theological emphasis not only on the body, but on the physical nature of the world in humanistic kind of Renaissance Catholic thought. But we can see his normal triangular composition, and we can see that these figures are very fleshy. They're starting to feel real. I mean, if you just look at the babies over here, you know, we look at Christ, the Christ child right here, and we look at John the Baptist kind of bowing to the Christ child. They're very convincing, right? They're this, like the fleshiness of them, the musculature of them, kind of how their bodies are shifting into space, and even how the Virgin's body is shifting into space as she's leaning towards the Christ child. These are very humanistic and very human movements that make the paintings more relatable. So now hopefully we can see there's an emphasis on the person rather than just on the spiritual heightened component, which this was not meant to be a spiritual person, but I just wanted, this is a good example of a portrait by Leonardo that they are emphasizing the real person. They're basing some of what they see and a lot of what they create on real people, real faces. So, and on to the masters, which Leonardo was, of course, considered a master, so don't think I wasn't calling him a master. But these works are by Raphael, and you can see very little of the Byzantine style that is left. Obviously, these figures have now become flesh. They've become very in flesh to us. They now seem real. They've kind of escaped this idea of a two-dimensional painting to give us a convincing three-dimensional space. And very little of the Byzantine influence remains. Now, I will say, kind of what we were talking about, this very embellished idea of the Byzantine style with gold, with a lot of figures, with a lot of angels, with a lot of symbolism. Artists are still employing that, but the styles and the reintroduction of this thing, the reintroduction of this is very, very different. So this is Fire in the Borgo by Raphael, and this can be found in the Vatican. This is part of some of his Vatican rooms, but we can see that these figures are very convincing and they're very diverse, right? We can see just the different amount of skin tones, the inclusion of colors, how a body would actually respond if they were carrying weight. We can see this figure carrying another male figure on his shoulders, right? We can see that this is pretty convincing, and this figure is jumping from the walls, right? So these figures are very convincing. They're very realistic. They're meant to entangle the viewer and make it seem as though we are also present. And of course, you can't talk about Renaissance art without talking about Michelangelo, who was kind of this key component in leaving this idea of the Byzantine style behind by making his figures so realistic and convincing. And we can see that just in his Pietà sculpture on the left over here. We can see as the Virgin grips a dead Christ right here, we can see the weight in his arms running through her hands, right? We can see her body shift in a very normal way. Her hips are where they need to be. Her knees are where they need to be. It looks like a real person, right? Even though it's meant to represent a spiritual figure. And you can see the same in this rendition of the Holy Family by Michelangelo as well. And you can also see this serpentine position, the shifting of the hips and shifting of the weight, and how the Virgin is paying attention to the Christ child as well. So these are very important distinctions between the Renaissance and the Byzantine. So, like I said, an aspect that remained was this idea of extremely decorative art that bordered the extreme, realism to the point that it almost seemed unnatural. Thus, art remains, like I said, cyclical, and the ideas are reborn into different cultural contexts. And so this is, of course, Michelangelo's Last Judgment. We can see there are a lot of busy figures, but these are no longer figures that belong to another plane in another world, right? These figures seem like they belong to our world, even though they're almost supernatural in a different way. You know, they're very strong, they're very muscular. They're very strong, they're very muscular, but they seem as though their bodies are part of this world rather than a different world, right? And so what you need to remember is that the Byzantine era was not a primitive form of art. It was just a different cultural context that the people were born into and that they were reflecting at the time. And with the kind of onset of humanistic thought and philosophy in art, the importance of re-emphasizing classics and the importance of antiquity, that's where Renaissance and Western art kind of made that shift into medieval Gothic and Renaissance styles and left the Byzantine behind. So it's a big lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've gotten to see kind of where the Renaissance started, how it was founded, that it was founded on these same ideas. They didn't just pop up one day, but like most of art throughout history, they were built upon, and the cultures were building upon one another and shifting, and the Renaissance just shifted very quickly, which is what makes it so fun to study, because there were a lot of politics and cultural and religious strife still happening even after the schism. So that's the end of our presentation. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, let me know.
I've got a question.
Okay.
This is Al. To what extent were these figures drawn out of their imagination, or did they set up models to give them the poses?
They did use models. Actually, Michelangelo got in trouble because he was using dead bodies as figure studies for dead figures, which was highly illegal at the time and profane. And so he did get in trouble, but you know, he pulled his way out of it because he was Michelangelo. So, but a lot of artists would study corpses, but they would also study live models. Raphael had a lot of live models in his studio, and eventually, now the Last Judgment obviously came a lot from Michelangelo's mind and just a very serious study of anatomy. But that is how they studied anatomy. They would use live models, or they would, you know, dig up dead bodies and use them.
All right, does anybody else have a question?
Well, thank you very much. It was a really informative talk.
That's very, very enjoyable.
Good. I'm glad you guys liked it. It's a fun time period to really study, and that shift I think is really interesting.
Good job, Sam. So, all right. So you obviously know that at the end of every program, I have to give what's coming up. So next week, this time, next Thursday, we have Explore Arkansas Art, and we are going over Lisa Cranachfield. She's an artist out of Little Rock, and she kind of she focuses on the woman's body, but she uses clothing. So she might use like drapery, like drapes that we would use on on our windows, different types of things like that. It's pretty cool. So that'll be at 7 o'clock next Thursday. And then Sam, this summer we are going to do lecture live, and for the entire summer we'll do it's called Sensual Art, a survey. And Sam, do you want to talk to them about the first one? I think it's coming up April 22nd. So instead of doing what we've been doing. April 22nd, this is what we're going to take on for the entire summer.
Yeah, so we know that throughout our history, an important aspect of art that has remained consistent in every culture is this idea of sensuality or sexuality. And so we didn't want to just name it sexuality, although that's an important component of sensual art, but we're really kind of finding the importance of this idea of the sensual nature of figures, why they're important to the culture at the time. And even though during maybe heightened religious times, how they still played an important role in the visual arts during certain time periods throughout history. And so we're going to start with a look at various components of ancient art, just to engage like this idea of what is the sensual in general and why it's so important both to artist and viewer and why it's so engaging to us. So it's going to be a fun lecture, and we will start with a look at ancient civilizations.
Yeah, it'll be pretty cool. And then we also, every Tuesday we have what we call random sketch. So it's like ages 13 and up. And you guys are always welcome to join. It's free. It's just register. Or we also do through Facebook Live. So either way, you guys can be a part of that. So thank you, Sam. Does anybody have any more questions for her before we jump off? All right. Thank you.